On a chilly autumn evening, as streetlights flickered to life across the city, Mrs. Chen drove her old Honda Civic through the quiet neighborhoods of West Valley. The car's engine hummed softly as she headed home from her second job at the local diner, where she'd been working extra shifts to save for her children's school supplies. In the backseat, her two precious children dozed peacefully, her 8-year-old son breathing softly while clutching his favorite superhero action figure, and her 4-year-old daughter curled up with the teddy bear she never went anywhere without. The night had been particularly exhausting. Mrs. Chen had spent hours serving tables with a smile, even when her feet ached and her back screamed for rest. But she never complained, not when every dollar meant something for her children's future. As a single mother, she'd learned to be both strong and gentle, finding ways to make ends meet while keeping her children's world filled with love and warmth. Her thoughts drifted to the pile of bills waiting at home and the parent-teacher conference scheduled for next week. The broken taillight had been on her to-fix list for weeks, but something more urgent always came up, like when her son needed new shoes for school or when her daughter's winter coat had become too small. The radio played softly in the background, a late-night talk show host's voice providing comfortable background noise as she navigated the familiar streets. She was just 10 minutes from home when blue and red lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, carefully pulling over to the side of the road. The police cruiser stopped behind her, its headlights flooding her car with bright light. Mrs. Chen took a deep breath, reaching for her purse where she kept her license and registration. In the backseat, her son stirred slightly but didn't wake. She glanced at her children through the rearview mirror, their peaceful faces giving her strength. As she waited for the officer to approach, Mrs. Chen rehearsed in her mind what she would say. She knew about the taillight. A neighbor had mentioned it last week. She would explain her situation honestly, hoping the officer would understand. Maybe she'd get lucky with just a warning. The repair shop opened early tomorrow, and she'd already planned to get it fixed before her morning shift. The tap on her window came, and she rolled it down, offering a tired but polite smile to the officer. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and the weight of what would become a life-changing encounter. What started as a routine traffic stop was about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake not just one family, but an entire community to its core. Little did Mrs. Chen know that this ordinary moment, something that happens thousands of times across the country every night, would become the beginning of a story that would raise profound questions about justice, humanity, and the responsibility of those sworn to protect and serve. As she reached for her documents, the sleeping children in the backseat had no idea that their world was about to change forever. This unfolding scene, bathed in the harsh glow of police lights and street lamps, would soon become more than just another traffic stop. It would become a moment that would be replayed countless times in news reports, court proceedings, and the nightmares of everyone involved. But for now, it was just a tired mother, her sleeping children, and a police officer approaching their car on a quiet autumn night. The officer's footsteps crunched on the gravel, each step bringing closer a future that none of them could have predicted. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she held her license and registration, ready to hand them over. She glanced one more time at her sleeping children in the rearview mirror, their innocent faces unaware of the tension building in their mother's shoulders. The night air grew colder, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the moon. What happened next would change not just one family's story, but would become a catalyst for change in a system that desperately needed reform. But at this moment, it was still just a routine traffic stop on an ordinary autumn night, with no hint of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The officer shined his flashlight through the window, its beam sweeping across Mrs. Chen's face and then into the backseat where her children slept. "License and registration," he said, his tone carrying an edge that made her stomach tighten. She handed over the documents with slightly trembling hands, explaining about the taillight and how she was planning to fix it first thing tomorrow morning. But something had changed in the officer's demeanor. He stepped back from the car, speaking into his radio in hushed tones. Mrs. Chen strained to hear what he was saying, her heart beating faster with each passing second. When he returned to her window, his entire attitude had shifted. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, no longer interested in her explanation about the taillight. Confused and increasingly worried, Mrs. Chen glanced back at her sleeping children. "But my children," she began, only to be cut off by the officer's stern voice. I said, "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." The night air bit at her skin as she carefully opened her door, trying not to wake her little ones. Her son stirred slightly, his superhero figure dropping from his loose grip onto the car floor. The officer's flashlight beam followed her every movement, making her feel like a criminal rather than a hard-working mother heading home from work. "I smell something suspicious," the officer declared, though Mrs. Chen knew there was nothing in her car except old French fry smell from the kids' dinner and her work uniform's lingering diner scent. Before she could protest, another police car pulled up, its lights painting the peaceful neighborhood street in alternating blue and red. Her daughter woke up then, confused and frightened by the lights. "Mama," her small voice called out from the backseat. Mrs. Chen's heart broke, as she wasn't allowed to comfort her child. Instead, she had to stand by and watch as a second officer approached her car, peering in at her now frightened children. "Please," she pleaded, "let me call my sister. She can come get the children. They're scared." But her requests seemed to fall on deaf ears as the officers huddled together, discussing something in low voices. Her son was awake now too, his face pressed against the window, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The situation spiraled further out of control when backup arrived. A third police car, lights flashing, pulled up to the scene. What had started as a simple traffic stop for a broken taillight had somehow transformed into something much more serious. Mrs. Chen stood helplessly as officers began to search her car, pulling out her work bag, rifling through her children's backpacks. Her daughter's crying grew louder, and her son tried to be brave, holding his sister's hand, but Mrs. Chen could see his lower lip trembling. "Please," she tried again. "They're just children. Let me at least comfort them." The officers continued their search, speaking into radios and shuffling through papers, seemingly deaf to the cries of frightened children and the pleas of their mother. Time seemed to slow down and speed up all at once. The neighborhood had come alive with curious onlookers, some filming with their phones from their porches, others whispering among themselves. Mrs. Chen felt exposed, humiliated, and most of all, terrified for her children. The lead officer finally approached her again, his face set in stern lines. "We're going to need you to come down to the station," he announced. Mrs. Chen's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "But my children," she began again. Only to be told that they would be coming too, standard procedure, they said. As they prepared to separate her from her children, putting them in different police cars, Mrs. Chen felt a surge of desperate maternal protection. She tried one last time to reason with them, to explain that she was just a mother heading home from work, that there had to be some mistake. But the machinery of law enforcement had already been set in motion, and no amount of pleading or explanation seemed able to stop it. As they led her toward a police car, she could hear her children calling for her, their voices filled with fear and confusion. The sound would haunt her dreams for years to come. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as 3 police cars pulled away from the curb, carrying a family whose only crime had been a broken taillight. The autumn night had turned cold, and somewhere in the distance, a clock struck midnight, marking the beginning of what would become one of the darkest chapters in the community's history. What no one knew then was that this night would become a turning point, not just for one family, but for an entire system that sometimes forgot the humanity of those it was meant to protect. The consequences of this night would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond this quiet neighborhood street, and raising questions that would demand answers from those in power. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cold tile floor. Mrs. Chen sat alone in an interrogation room, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. The clock on the wall ticked endlessly, marking each minute she was separated from her children. "Please," she said for what felt like the 100th time to the officer sitting across from her. "My children need me. My daughter has breathing problems sometimes. I need to make sure they're okay." The officer merely wrote something in his notebook, showing no reaction to her increasingly desperate pleas. Down the hall, in what they called a holding area, her 2 children huddled together on a hard plastic bench. Her son, trying to be brave for his little sister, kept his arm around her shoulders as she whimpered softly. The teddy bear she always carried had been left behind in the car, and without it, she felt even more lost and scared. Time dragged on as officers moved back and forth through the station, some glancing at the children, others ignoring them completely. Her son raised his hand several times, trying to get someone's attention, but most officers walked past without acknowledging him. He could tell his sister's breathing was becoming different, shorter, more labored, just like the time she had gotten sick at school. In the interrogation room, Mrs. Chen answered the same questions over and over. Where was she coming from? Where was she going? Did she know about the broken taillight? Each time she explained about her job at the diner, about being a single mother, about needing to get home to relieve the babysitter. But the officers seemed more interested in searching for something wrong than listening to her truth. I need to make a phone call, she insisted. My sister can come get the children. They shouldn't be here. The officer finally looked up from his notebook. We'll get to that, he said dismissively, before launching into another round of questions about her workplace, her immigration status, her history. Back in the holding area, her daughter's breathing had become more troubled. She coughed repeatedly, each breath seeming to catch in her throat. Her brother, panic rising in his chest, called out louder now, My sister needs help. She can't breathe right. A young officer glanced their way but continued walking, assuming it was just a child being dramatic. The children weren't the only ones who noticed something was wrong. A desk sergeant, new to the force, watched with growing concern as the little girl's face grew paler, her breathing more labored. He hesitated, caught between protocol and what he knew in his heart was right. Mrs. Chen could feel something was wrong. Mother's intuition, perhaps, or just the deep connection between a parent and child. She became more insistent, her voice rising with urgency. Please, my daughter has breathing problems sometimes. I need to check on my children now. The atmosphere in the station shifted as her daughter's coughing became more pronounced, echoing down the hallways. The young desk sergeant finally moved, walking quickly toward the holding area. Other officers began to notice, looking up from their paperwork, some rising from their desks. Her son's voice rose in panic. Please help. My sister can't breathe. The sound carried through the station, reaching Mrs. Chen in the interrogation room. She stood up so quickly her chair fell backward, moving toward the door despite the officer's commands to stay seated. The next few minutes would become a blur in everyone's memory. The rush of movement, the calls for medical assistance, the sound of a mother fighting to reach her children. The young desk sergeant radioed for emergency medical services, his hands shaking as he made the call. Through the chaos, Mrs. Chen finally broke free from the interrogation room, running toward her children's voices. The sight that greeted her would be forever burned into her memory. Her daughter struggling for breath, her son crying helplessly beside her, and a circle of officers standing around, only now realizing the severity of what their indifference had caused. Call an ambulance. Someone shouted, though the words seemed to come too late. Mrs. Chen reached for her daughter, gathering her in her arms, feeling the desperate struggle for each breath. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, her small hands clutching at her chest. The station erupted into frantic activity, but for Mrs. Chen, the world had narrowed to just her children, her son's terrified face, her daughter's weakening grip on her hand. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, but they seemed far away, almost dreamlike, as a mother held her child and prayed for help to arrive in time. What had started as a simple traffic stop had spiraled into something unthinkable, and in those moments, as emergency responders rushed into the station, everyone present would be forever changed by what they witnessed. The true cost of indifference, of treating people as less than human, was about to become devastatingly clear. The emergency medical team burst through the police station doors, their equipment rattling as they rushed down the hallway. The little girl lay limp in her mother's arms now, her breathing shallow and irregular. Mrs. Chen's face was streaked with tears as she gently rocked her daughter, whispering soft words of comfort that seemed to get lost in the chaos around them. The paramedics worked quickly, their trained hands moving with purpose as they assessed the situation. An oxygen mask was placed over the child's small face, but her lips had already taken on a bluish tint. Her brother stood nearby, frozen in place, watching as strangers tried to help his sister. One of the paramedics noticed his distress and gently guided him closer to his mother, understanding that the family needed to be together. How long has she been having difficulty breathing? The lead paramedic asked, his voice urgent but kind. Before Mrs. Chen could answer, her son spoke up, his voice trembling but clear. I tried to tell them. I kept telling them she needed help. Nobody would listen. The words hung heavy in the air, and several officers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of their inaction settling on their shoulders. The young desk sergeant who had finally called for help stood against the wall, his face pale with shock and guilt. He watched as the medical team worked, his mind replaying all the times he'd walked past the holding area, hearing but not really listening to the children's pleas for help. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The paramedics spoke in quick, hushed tones, their movements becoming more urgent. They transferred the little girl onto a stretcher, the oxygen mask fogging slightly with each weak breath. Mrs. Chen refused to let go of her daughter's hand, even as they began to move toward the exit. "Mama," her son called out, suddenly afraid of being left behind again. The lead paramedic made a quick decision, letting both mother and son ride in the ambulance. As they rushed through the station doors, the harsh glare of emergency lights painted the scene in surreal colors. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked frantically. Mrs. Chen held her son close with one arm while maintaining her grip on her daughter's hand with the other. The siren wailed above them as they sped through the night, but it couldn't drown out the sound of the heart monitor's increasingly irregular beeps. Back at the station, a heavy silence had fallen. Officers stood in small groups, some avoiding each other's eyes, others openly discussing what had gone wrong. The young desk sergeant sat at his desk, staring at nothing, the image of the little girl's frightened face burned into his memory. The ambulance raced through red lights, its siren clearing a path through the late-night traffic. Inside, the paramedics never stopped working, their voices staying professionally calm even as the situation became more dire. Mrs. Chen's son buried his face in her side, unable to watch as more medical equipment was attached to his sister. Time seemed to move differently in that ambulance, stretching and compressing like a rubber band. Every second felt like an hour, yet somehow the hospital appeared too quickly, suggesting that not enough time had passed for things to be okay. The emergency room doors burst open as the medical team rushed in with the stretcher. Mrs. Chen ran alongside, still holding her daughter's hand, until a gentle but firm nurse stopped her at the trauma room doors. "You need to let them work," the nurse said softly, her eyes full of understanding. Mrs. Chen stood there, her son clutching her waist, as they watched through the windows. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced efficiency, their voices muffled through the glass. The monitors beeped, medications were administered, and prayers were whispered in multiple languages. But sometimes, even with all the medical knowledge and equipment in the world, when help comes too late, there's nothing left to do. The moment when everything changed was marked by a single, sustained tone from one of the monitors. The medical team's movements became more urgent, then slowly, terribly, began to slow. The doctor emerged from the trauma room, his face carrying the weight of news no parent should ever have to hear. Mrs. Chen knew before he spoke. Every parent knows that look. Her knees buckled, and if not for the nurse's quick reaction, she might have fallen. Her son, too young to fully understand but old enough to sense the finality in the air, began to cry silently. The sound of his mother's grief, when it came, would echo through the hospital corridors, a sound of loss so profound it seemed to touch everyone who heard it. Outside the hospital, the night continued as if nothing had changed. Cars passed by, their headlights sweeping across the building's facade. Somewhere in the city, other sirens wailed, other emergencies unfolded. But in that hospital corridor, time stood still as a family's world shattered into pieces that would never quite fit back together again. The young desk sergeant, hearing the news over the police radio, quietly stood up from his desk and walked out of the station. In his pocket, his resignation letter was already half written in his mind. Sometimes the weight of what we failed to do becomes too heavy to carry in uniform. Morning came to the city like any other day, but nothing was the same. At the police station, senior officers huddled in closed-door meetings, their voices carrying through the thin walls. Papers shuffled, phones rang, and an atmosphere of tension filled every corner of the building. The police chief stood at his office window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges. On his desk lay the preliminary incident report, its pages telling a story that made his stomach turn. A child had died in their custody, not from violence, but from negligence. In some ways, that felt even worse. Down in the records room, A young officer sat alone, his hands shaking as he reviewed the body camera footage from the previous night. He had been there, had seen everything unfold, and the weight of his silence now felt unbearable. The footage showed it all: the repeated pleas for help, the dismissive responses, the growing desperation in the children's voices. "We need to handle this internally," one senior officer suggested during the morning briefing. "Keep it contained." But the young officer, listening from the back of the room, felt something shift inside him. The faces of Mrs. Chen and her children flashed through his mind: the fear, the helplessness, the final tragic moments. Outside the station, reporters had begun to gather. Word had spread through the community, carried on whispers and text messages. A child had died in police custody. A mother's desperate pleas had been ignored. People wanted answers. The police department's public relations team crafted careful statements using words like "unfortunate incident" and "thorough investigation." But they couldn't erase what had happened, couldn't unsee what the body cameras had recorded. The truth lay in digital files, waiting to be discovered. The young officer spent his lunch break sitting in his car, staring at his phone. He had copied the footage, all of it. Every minute, every ignored plea, every moment leading up to the tragedy. His finger hovered over the send button, a journalist's number ready in his phone. The weight of his badge seemed heavier than ever. Inside the station, other officers wrestled with their own guilt. The desk sergeant who had finally called for help sat at his desk, writing and rewriting his report. How could he explain why it took so long? How could anyone justify ignoring a child in distress? By afternoon, the department's internal affairs division had taken over. They called officers one by one into interview rooms, asking questions about procedures, about response times, about why nobody had acted sooner. But their questions felt hollow, focused more on protecting the department than understanding the truth. The young officer watched his colleagues file in and out of interviews. He heard them constructing their defenses, explaining away their inaction. "We followed procedure," they said. "We had no way of knowing." But he remembered the look in the little girl's eyes as she struggled to breathe, remembered her brother's desperate attempts to get help. At his desk, he opened his computer and began to write. Not a report, but a statement, the truth as he had witnessed it. His fingers moved across the keyboard, recording every detail he could remember. The timestamps from the body camera footage matched his memories perfectly. The sun was setting when he finally made his decision. The footage, along with his written statement, would tell the story that needed to be told. Not the sanitized version the department wanted to present, but the raw, painful truth of what happened when those sworn to protect forgot their duty to serve. His hand was steady as he pressed send, transmitting the files to the journalist he had contacted. There would be consequences, he knew that. His career in law enforcement would likely end. But as he thought of Mrs. Chen, of her son who had tried so hard to save his sister, he knew he had made the right choice. Within hours, the footage began to spread. News outlets picked up the story, social media exploded with outrage, and the carefully constructed narrative of the police department began to crumble. The truth, captured in high-definition video and audio, was impossible to ignore or explain away. The young officer cleared out his desk that night, placing his badge and service weapon on his supervisor's desk. As he walked out of the station for the last time, he felt lighter somehow. Outside, the first news vans were arriving, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal fingers searching for truth. The story was out now, and there would be no containing it. The footage showed what everyone needed to see, not just what had happened that night, but what could happen when power forgot its responsibility to protect the vulnerable. It was a truth that would demand change, that would shake a system built on silence and compliance. As he drove home in the gathering darkness, the young officer thought about Mrs. Chen and her surviving son. He hoped that somehow, in bringing the truth to light, he had honored the memory of the little girl who should never have died in their care. Sometimes, he realized, the most powerful act of service is simply telling the truth. The footage spread like wildfire across social media. People shared it, commented on it, and demanded answers. Within days, crowds began gathering outside the police station, their signs held high in the morning sun. Justice for the Chen family became more than just words, it became a rallying cry. Mrs. Chen's living room filled with community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and activists. She sat quietly on her couch, her son leaning against her side as they discussed legal strategies and public responses. The boy hadn't spoken much since that night, but his eyes followed every conversation, understanding more than anyone realized. A seasoned civil rights attorney sat across from Mrs. Chen, her voice gentle but determined. "What happened to your daughter was more than just negligence," she explained. "It was a systemic failure, and we're going to make sure it never happens to another family." Mrs. Chen nodded, squeezing her son's hand. The city streets filled with protesters, their numbers growing each day. Students walked out of schools, workers left their jobs, and families brought their children to march. The crowd was diverse, people from all walks of life united by their horror at what had happened and their determination to create change. Local businesses hung pictures of the little girl in their windows. She smiled out at passers-by, a school photo showing bright eyes and missing front teeth. A reminder that behind the headlines was a child who should have had her whole life ahead of her. The police department tried to manage the crisis. They held press conferences, promised investigations, and spoke about policy reviews. But the public had seen the footage, had watched officers ignore a child's desperate pleas for help. No amount of carefully worded statements could erase those images. The young officer who leaked the footage found unexpected support. Other officers, haunted by their own silence that night, began speaking out. They shared their own stories of times when protocol trumped humanity, when the system protected itself instead of the people it served. Mrs. Chen's attorney worked tirelessly, building a case that went beyond just one night's tragedy. She gathered evidence of similar incidents, of patterns of negligence, of times when the most vulnerable had been ignored or dismissed. The case was becoming something larger, a challenge to the entire system. Community meetings sprang up across the city. People gathered in churches, community centers, and school gymnasiums to share their own experiences with law enforcement. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a deeper problem that needed addressing. The media coverage grew. National news networks picked up the story. Interviews with Mrs. Chen, carefully conducted with respect for her grief, showed the human cost of institutional indifference. Her quiet dignity and sorrow moved millions, turning statistics into something deeply personal. Politicians couldn't ignore the growing pressure. City council meetings became forums for public outrage. The mayor, feeling the heat of public scrutiny, announced the formation of a special commission to investigate police procedures and recommend reforms. But the real change came from the ground up. Community groups organized civilian oversight committees. Local medical professionals volunteered to train officers in recognizing medical emergencies. Teachers developed programs to help children understand their rights while building better relationships with law enforcement. The police chief finally resigned, acknowledging that the department needed new leadership to rebuild trust. Several officers involved that night were suspended pending investigation. The young desk surgeon who had finally called for help became a vocal advocate for reform, speaking publicly about the cost of silence. Mrs. Chen's son started speaking again, first in whispers to his mother, then in a strong, clear voice at community meetings. He told his sister's story, not just the tragedy of her last moments, but the joy of who she had been, her love of dancing, her habit of sharing her snacks, her infectious laugh. The lawsuit moved forward, gathering momentum as more evidence came to light. But for Mrs. Chen, it was never about money. She wanted change, real, lasting change that would protect other families from experiencing her pain. 1 month after the tragedy, the city council passed the first round of reforms. They named it after Mrs. Chen's daughter, a reminder that behind every policy change was a human story, a life that mattered, a reason to do better. The crowds outside the police station grew smaller, but they didn't disappear. People kept vigil, their candles lighting up the night, their presence a constant reminder that the community was watching, waiting, demanding better from those sworn to protect them. And in a small apartment across town, Mrs. Chen held her son close each night, telling him stories about his sister, keeping her memory alive. Together, they were learning to carry their grief while fighting for change, turning their pain into purpose, their loss into legacy. 1 year later, the police station looked different. New signs hung in the lobby, written in multiple languages, clearly explaining people's rights. A medical professional was always on duty, and officers underwent regular training on recognizing health emergencies. These changes weren't just on paper, they represented real shifts in how things worked. Mrs. Chen stood at a podium in City Hall, her son beside her, as the mayor signed the final piece of comprehensive police reform legislation. The room was packed with community members, activists, and families who had supported their cause. Some held pictures of her daughter, whose story had sparked this transformation. The foundation she had established in her daughter's memory was already making waves. It provided legal support to families dealing with law enforcement, offered medical training to police departments across the country, and created programs to build bridges between communities and those who served them. Her son, now 9 years old, had found his voice as a young advocate. He spoke at schools about knowing your rights and the importance of speaking up. When he talked about his sister, he didn't just share the tragedy, he shared hope for a better future, one where other children would be heard and protected. The young officer who had leaked the footage now worked with the foundation, training other officers about the importance of moral courage and the duty to speak up. His decision to share the truth had cost him his badge, but had given him a new purpose. Other officers often sought his advice, wanting to learn how to balance their duty to the department with their duty to humanity. The police department itself had undergone a complete overhaul. New leadership brought new priorities. Community engagement, transparency, and accountability became more than just buzzwords. Officers received regular training in cultural sensitivity, medical emergency response, and de-escalation techniques. Every new officer now spent time learning about what happened that night, not just from reports and footage, but from Mrs. Chen herself. She would sit with them, sharing her story, helping them understand that behind every interaction was a human being, a family, a life that mattered. The desk sergeant who had finally called for help that night became an instructor at the police academy, teaching a course on ethical decision-making. He never let officers forget that following procedure wasn't enough. They needed to listen to their conscience and remember their fundamental duty to protect life. The civil rights attorney who had taken Mrs. Chen's case worked tirelessly to spread these reforms to other cities. She traveled across the country, sharing the story and the changes it had inspired. Other communities began adopting similar measures, creating their own versions of what became known as the Chen Protocols. Community oversight committees became standard practice, with regular meetings between police leadership and local residents. These weren't just formalities. Real concerns were addressed, real changes were made, and real trust began to build. Mrs. Chen's living room still held her daughter's pictures, her toys, her memory. But now it also held awards for community service, letters of thanks from families they'd helped, and drawings from children who learned about their rights through the Foundation's programs. The Foundation's biggest project was a scholarship program for children who wanted to become doctors, lawyers, or social workers, people who could help build a more just and caring system. The first group of scholars included children from all backgrounds, each committed to making a difference in their communities. On quiet evenings, Mrs. Chen and her son would visit the memorial garden, planted in her daughter's honor outside the police station. What had once been a place of tragedy had become a symbol of hope and change. Officers would often stop to pay their respects, some leaving small tokens, others simply standing in quiet reflection. The changes weren't perfect. There was still work to be done, still improvements to be made. But something fundamental has shifted. A system that had once protected itself at the cost of human life had begun to remember its true purpose, to serve and protect all members of the community. As Mrs. Chen watched her son grow stronger and more confident each day, she knew that her daughter's life, though far too short, had created ripples of change that would continue long into the future. Through grief had come purpose, through loss had come legacy, and through tragedy had come transformation. The story didn't end, it evolved. Each new day brought new challenges, new opportunities for change, new chances to ensure that no other family would face what they had faced. And in that ongoing work, in that constant striving for better, her daughter's spirit lived on,